see everyone's waiting again. Since the time is limited, I just wanted to kind of give a little bit of background and information on what I do, what I'm known for currently, and kind of give you a little bit of history of what the transcription actually entails. And then I'll just leave the rest of the time up to you to ask any questions you may have, or do a little bit of demonstrating some of the technical tricks and the trade scheme transcription, and transcribing isn't something that I took a class in, or is anything that's usually offered at any conservatory that I know of. I just started doing it by myself. And we learn, I think, the best through experience and kind of going through the normal process of, and just like composition, I think, the best teacher is actually yourself, to experience these things for yourself. As many of you probably already know, the famous composers for transcriptions are probably listed. Busoni are the first people that come to mind. Busoni got to the point where he started getting introduced at parties as Mr. Bach Busoni, because people just knew him as a transcriber and not as a pianist or even a composer. He was supremely talented in both those areas. The actual first big major composer that I can think of that did transcriptions is Bach himself. And while it's true that for Bach it was more for educational purposes, and Bach was probably the greatest assimilator of different nationalistic style and kind of synthesizing them to create his own style. But he would, for example, transcribe a Vivaldi piece or something in a French Baroque composer like Lebrun or Rameau. And he did it to, back then the music wasn't nearly as published as it is now. In fact, most of Bach's music was not published during his lifetime, which is kind of staggering if you think about it. So a lot of times these things had to be done by hand, and I think through that process he was able to absorb these styles and become a really cosmopolitan composer. Mozart also was very much this way. So we have some Bach transcriptions. I think the most famous one is the Concerto for 4 keyboards, which is actually a transcription of a Vivaldi piece. And then we move on to Mozart. Mozart in about 1780s, probably reference this movie again. Has anyone seen Amadeus? Okay. Remember the guy with the kind of crazy wig, the golden wig that had the walking stick most of the time? That was Baron Van Sweet, and he was the court musicologist and librarian. And he was very much interested in old music, which is namely Baroque music. You have to realize at this point, this idea of playing old music is just a complete. If Mozart came back today and found we have CDs of his music, I think he'd be completely flabbergasted. I think he'd be, what are you doing? Why are you playing this old stuff? So that conception is completely foreign to them. So Bach was completely unknown to Mozart until he encountered Baron Van Sweet. And Van Sweet would hold these musicales over the weekend where they would play this antiquated old music of Bach and Handel. And Mozart was wild over Bach and Handel. He loved their music. And he transcribed for the society that these musicales were involved with a lot of pieces. So you would take like a Handel or a Troy, for example, and rearrange it. Or he would even take original orchestration and beef it up a little bit. Nowadays, if you touch a note of, say, Beethoven's symphony, reorchestrate something, add extra words, I think it's sacrilege. But again, you have to realize, putting it in their time frame, they considered that old music with the basso continuo it didn't have enough stuff in it, so he had to add things to make it more up to date. As we move on from Mozart's student, Hummel, if you actually ever encounter any of his music, it's pretty brilliant. He wrote a piano concerto that's almost unplayable, it's really difficult. Stephen Huff actually said that's the hardest, it's much harder than the Rock 30. It's the hardest concerto you ever had to record. It's the Hummel concerto. And he was probably next to Beethoven, up to Beethoven's son. He was the greatest pianist in Vienna, without a doubt. And Mozart's most brilliant pupil. And he transcribed a lot of Mozart's symphonies. There's a wonderful transcription of the famous Symphony No. 40 in G minor. It's definitely worth investigating to see kind of how he managed these things. The argument can be made a lot of times with these type of transcriptions before this that they were more for study purposes rather than actual performance. But I think there's a lot of pedagogical value for you as pianists and composers to try to do these transcriptions for yourself because, one, it's fun. it expands, it really expands your vocabulary and your color range, and it kind of opens up your mind to different possibilities. Two, it puts you directly in the mind, I think, puts you directly in the mind of the composer. And I think there's a lot of value in doing these kind of recreative acts. And you don't feel like you're way down here, the composer's way up here, and you have to reflect in front of someone like God, like Beethoven, and you're so paralyzed that you can't even play a note. I think it's, these were extraordinary, men and women, these composers, but they're not gods or demigods. They're human beings, and they have thoughts and emotions. And yeah, sure, I'm sure their sensitivities and their the way that they were able to express these sensitivities was much greater than their average plot. But I think they were affected emotionally by what they went through in life, and it's reflected in the music. I think you should put yourself in a position when you play these pieces. And that's why I even don't like the term when you say interpreting music. I think you're actually recreating it on the spot. You have to kind of put yourself in a position that this music has never been heard before. That's why things like last night are so exciting, because these are pieces that have never been seen the light of day. They don't come to life until they're performed in front of an audience. And I think that's a really vital and important aspect of music that sometimes gets lost because of the age of recordings. And I think the more you can put yourself in the mind of a composer and work with living composers, you can kind of shed light on it. How I love to call it Beethoven. Say, what do you think in here? You can't, but you can put yourself in his mindset, I think, if you do this sort of process. That's why I think it's great that so many of our composers as well. It's not very well known, but actually Beethoven did his own transcription of the violin concerto for solo piano. And while it's certainly not as effective, I don't think, on the piano, I think it's interesting to actually go through that process. And he felt that it was important enough to do. So Beethoven was actually did a lot of transcriptions as well. Some of these sacred composers that we consider, we shouldn't change a note of, were probably some of the most creative in certain ways. Mozart and Beethoven and Bach, Bach and Mozart, and Beethoven in particular, probably the greatest improvisers of their day. So to rearrange these things for other mediums, I think, wasn't something that was completely foreign or something that would be distasteful to them at all. As we move on from Beethoven, this is kind of the first big figure where you get the sense that these are compositions and arrangements to actually show off the skill of not only the composer but the performer. This is kind of an era of a little bit more showmanship. And Paganini was actually the one that kind of paved the way for this. And everyone went crazy over Paganini. Everyone did all sorts of transcriptions on Paganini to this day. Probably the most transcribed famous things in Paganini 24th Caprice. Everyone can recognize that. Kind of talking about my own processes of transcriptions, and I've done a variety of things, everything from songs to symphonies to single instrument transference and string quartets. And just as a word of caution, string quartets are extremely difficult to transcribe. I don't know why. You would think it would be the easiest, and certainly because you just have 4 instruments to work with. And I find it, I didn't feel so badly after I found out. The list did a marvelous transcription of all the 9 Beethoven symphonies. It was a huge hit. It was a commercial success for the Rykoff and Herald. All these amateur pianists really, probably couldn't play half of them, but they tried, and it was nice to have just, again, this is pre-recording era, so they just couldn't go out and buy a CD of the Beethoven Fifth Symphony. A lot of times they had to sit down and play it themselves. So these things were really vital to the amateur public. And this was asked by Rykoff and Herald to transcribe all of the Beethoven string quartets because it was such a success with the symphonies, and after trying for years, he couldn't come up with a single movement to his satisfaction. So again, don't be discouraged if you can't do the string quartet transcription, because it's a special sound world. Symphonic transcriptions are kind of nice in the way that you can sort of pile sonority on top of sonority and get away with it. String quartet, it'll kind of ruin the balance if you try to do this sort of thing. If you're going to go the transcription route, I would probably first recommend trying to do a simple song. There you can kind of have some interesting explorations of texture against the melody, and you can do some sort of displacement of melody a lot of times. You can put it in the thumb and sort of work around that. personal process with transcriptions is usually I'll hear something and immediately it'll spark in my head, okay, maybe this is not easy on the piano. So I kind of have an initial sound image of what it is. And then I'll write it out, and then I'll work it out on the piano. This got me in trouble once because I didn't look at the score for this section, this transcription that I'm playing tonight. It's a famous guitar piece by Koji. And it utilizes a really cool guitar technique where you do a tremolo here, and you're playing basically bass line with your thumb relief. It's this continuous tremolo. And it's a very, very clever trick that I didn't figure out even from hearing it until I actually saw the score. Because I just assumed it was a continuous tremolo that was 4 notes. So I actually thought it was, which is really hard to play. But Tyga does something interesting in that he leaves out the first note, but the bass plays that first note here, so your ear doesn't perceive that hole in the sound. So it's actually, so I have the whole thing written out with the other version, and I'm trying to play it, and I'm just completely discouraged. I don't think there's any possible way if I look at the score. So I had to rewrite the whole thing, and then I added some things as well, but that's one of the pitfalls of kind of doing it without looking at the music. So at some point I was avoiding the mistake that I didn't actually look at the orchestral score or whatever score that you're doing to kind of determine exactly what the configuration is. And then you can change stuff depending on your own taste after that. But if anyone have any questions or comments and thoughts about it? Has anyone written? I know you won't compose, but has anyone tried writing transcriptions or songs or what's any orchestral stuff? Did you?
Sing songs.
This one? Yeah. So I know you obviously know the Godowski transcription of that, which is interesting because it's in G major. He actually changed it to G flat and adds all this chromatic fall roll and craziness that Godowski. Godowski is also one of the famous transcribers in history. He literally did transcriptions of basically all the Chopin ancients. He did rewritings that very clever rework. He's called Chopin ancients. He did 53 versions of them.
How challenging is it to write for other instruments that you don't know how to play yourself?
Well, egotistically, it's one of the reasons why I like to do it, because I wish I could play the guitar, I wish I could find a string like that. So you do have to have familiarity with what you're working with, the material that you're working with. And as far as the guitar, I've been told, the tremolo thing on the guitar is not easy, but it's certainly not as possible on the pianos. So I actually had to kind of retrain myself to be able to play that piece, just to get the endurance to keep up the particular technique for like 6 pages. So you do kind of run into things. And certain things, certain devices on for example, orchestral transcriptions, like a 10-penny roll. Usually, you'll do something like, just do a tremolo like that to kind of do the 10-penny roll. You can also kind of do something, you can do a fast octave to sort of stimulate that. So you kind of come up with your own ideas. And that's the other kind of fun thing to do with transcriptions is you can tailor these transcriptions to whatever strengths you may have as a technician or avoid any weaknesses you think you have as a technician. And that's what Horowitz does so wonderfully with his transcriptions. That's why they're so effective. He's a supreme colorist, but he knows the keyboard in and out. And I think studying his transcriptions really kind of, I think he expanded vocabulary even beyond this, what he's able to do. So it's an excellent study guide again to kind of expand your vocabulary in terms of color and range.
We were talking last night about the difference between a transcription and an arrangement.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say a transcription is specifically for a new instrument, and an arrangement maybe takes more liberties with like adding, subtracting, embellishing?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Philosophically for me, a transcription tends to be more quote-unquote faithful to the original. You'll notice with, let's say, Liszt and the Don Fantasy, I wouldn't call that a transcription. And I don't think you would refer to that as a transcription because he takes, it's basically a pastiche of all the themes. And it may have been something that he can improvise on the spot. kind of shooed the violins off the stage into this huge, she kind of then brought the violins back, and everyone was like, it felt so out of place. I felt a little bad for the poor violins, but in the case of the drama fantasy and the normal fantasy, I think those are more fantasious or arrangements as opposed to pure transcription. But again, even with a transcription, you have to make some concessions for either limitations of the piano or things that you can do on the piano that aren't possible on the instrument that was initially conceived for. And that's where you kind of have to use your own judgment as far as, it's a bit of a gray area between transcription and mission. I think, bottom line, I think they're interchangeable terms, but I think there's more of a transformation with the arrangements. But I think they're interchangeable terms.
They say sometimes as a teacher, whatever, when I'm working with students, and sometimes they play instruments and they can other instruments and they want to use other things, but they want to use other instruments and work vice versa. That's where I find myself.
Right, yeah. Well, one of my pet peeves, well, I've got a lot of pet peeves. One of my big pet peeves is, I was told as a student, and I think it's great advice, imitate a singer here, I should be a woodwind singer, I should be a French horn. And yet, on the other hand, these are some of the same people who say these transcriptions are, just these atrocious abominations full of meretricious virtuosity. That's a correct quote, by the way, I think, it's a professional pianist. Regarding copies of transcription. But so I can't reconcile those two things. Why is it okay to do this but not that? And I just, one of the other pet peeves of mine, and I never get a straight answer from these so-called purists about it, is the modern piano, as we know, really only came into existence towards the beginning of the 20th century. So it's this huge swath of repertoire that we're playing on an instrument that is absolutely alien to the composer that composed it. We play Bach, and I love Bach on the piano, but it's already, to me, it's already a transcription because it's not on the piano and the instrument that was originally intended for. So we make adjustments, and I think Bach can be played wonderfully on the piano. But again, you get, you shouldn't touch the pedals because Bach can have pedals. Well, if you feel that way, then don't play Bach on the piano at all. It's fine if you don't play Bach on the piano at all, but I don't think you can, have those two kind of opposing viewpoints and be so vehement about, authenticity per se, and then ignore all performance practice. A lot of these people that ignore a lot of performance practice things, by the way, are against spontaneous improvisation and denying dogs and things like that. They just only play what's in the score, and that again is a big philosophical difference where these people think the score is something that should be, I think it should be respected as well. But they basically, I get the impression they're about to see it behind glass and see in the Metropolitan Art Museum or something, and just look at it, genuflect in front of it. And I think it's more of a living, breathing guide and kind of a window into the emotional life of the composer. I think for me, the best performances are things that bring out that rather than just playing everything straight accurately. So yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
About that very thing.
Yeah.
In some Liszt pieces, particularly in his pilgrimages, you can get into these heavy passage work areas where he's playing passage. And then he comes back and he does it again, but with such minute changes, it screws your memory.
Yeah.
Because it's twisted. So it's, you're sitting there saying, how can I remember that this time it actually does this little thing?
Yeah.
And I was thinking one day when I was frustrated by this because I was trying to get it exactly right. He probably did he ever play it the same way twice when he was performing in his parlors and performing for people? He played it from his head. Did he actually play those passages that distinctly?
From my experience in reading and just reading letters of people who heard these guys, with Chopin in particular, I'm almost 100% certain he never played it exactly twice.
Which means all filigree that you play was an improv on his part.
I believe so. And he was constantly changing his mind. There's no definitive version of a lot of his pieces because we have 4 or 5 different versions of it. So which one is the definitive version? And with Liszt, I have no doubt that's absolutely the same thing. I mean, we have reworkings of the same piece that I just mentioned yesterday, the Transcendental Agents. There's 3 versions of the Transcendental Agents. The first version he wrote when he was about 16 years old and was studying with Czerny. And some of those are about as interesting as a Czerny exercise, frankly. They're whatever, they are what they are. The second so difficult. He was probably the only pianist on the planet who could play it. And to this day, I only know of one pianist who's ever played all of them live in a concert, and he is a gentleman named Alexander Paley. And I think he must have sweated about 20 pounds by the I mean, some of these things are so horrendously difficult that it's inconceivable. And that's one thing that's never been studied. Talk about this quantum leap between the first and the second version of the transcendental ages. And then he probably thought, if I actually want people to actually play these pieces, I'm going to cut a couple of these down. And there's some really, really cool things in the second version of transcendental ages in terms of texture. If you look at the second version of Villiard, for example, he has this crazy octave type texture that's nearly unplayable, but you can sort of get what he was trying to do with his pianistic technique. And again, he's trying to expand the vocabulary. But he probably sensibly thought, well, I actually want some people to play this piece, so I'm just going to just do straight, instead. So yeah, there's nothing. I definitely don't think these are just really creative people. I don't think anything set in stone. And that's one of the philosophical problems I have with people that just are kind of these puritanical sword worshippers. Sorry, Barth was here. He probably didn't think this or something. But I can't reconcile those points of view when you're so strict about it. I think there's give and take between both sides. Again, I don't think you should sit down with this one where they ignore everything and do whatever else you want. It has to come from a really informed sense of subjectivity about what you're doing, and that takes a lot of study. You have to study about their life, you have to study their letters, you have to study the people that are around them, and the cultural milieu that they were involved with. Obviously, these were affected by political. The only composer I think that kind of lived even outside of the real world in a certain way was Mozart, because he could write the most charming, happy music when he was basically on his deathbed. He writes the K59 595 Concerto, and it's one of the happiest things he ever wrote. And it's just he's half dead. On the other hand, I don't think it's a coincidence that he wrote his first minor piece after this disastrous trip to Paris. His mother died, and if you read the letters between him and his father, he puts off telling his father that his mother has died, and it's just excruciating reading these letters. Just how heartbroken he is. He can't tell his father that she's died, and finally, and it's something for which I don't think his father ever completely forgave him. But that's when the first minor review, the 304 final sonnet. I think even more significantly, one of the most angriest pieces he ever written was I find it very hard to believe that's not a coincidence that he wrote those two pieces after his mother died. So even Mozart, I think, was affected that way. And certainly all the romantic composers were affected by other forms of literature. Schumann was literary or painting, or it's all part. So if you study a composer, I really encourage you to study the literature and the art and the architecture and even some of the fashion. If you want to learn about Rococo style, you have to study the architecture and the furniture to get a feel for that. So you become educated in a very broad way about these composers. And I think it's fun. I think it's fascinating about their lives. They're not just some mythical figure, so I would like to put myself in the place of actually knowing. I imagine, if I could have lunch with any composer, who would I choose to have lunch with? It's usually a tie between Liszt and Beethoven. I don't know. It's a good topic for another conversation. Any other questions? Yeah.
Is there a transcription that you did that you had a lot of difficulty with, or a favorite one that you've done before? The first transcription I did actually was before a chanson, but then I tackled the Death in the Major String Quartet. And the second movement was really easy. I thought, okay, I'm good at this stuff. And I tried the first, third, and fourth movements, and that really took a long time to work out. Working out string textures, I think, is the most difficult thing to try to do, because you get a lot of tremolo figures, and you get a lot of repeated figures that may or may not work so well on the piano, and because of the lack of sustained power on the piano, you really have to make some concessions when you do that kind of direct translation. You may have to add some things to prolong the live line, for example. You may have to play just a bit faster. A lot of times that's the complaint I get with some pieces. It's like, oh, why is it so fast? And it's like, well, sustain more, but it has to move a little. So some of the more kinetic pieces, like last movements of string pieces, tend to work better on the piano than some. Although in case of Schubert, the reason why I did it was a little bit tongue in cheek because it's actually a transcription itself. The thing, I don't know if you know the it was actually originally a meter, which he later transcribed for the string quartet here, and he wrote a beautiful set of variations on it. Schubert defines one of these composers who stole it himself, and later, reused that material in later pieces. So, I don't know if that answers your question, but string writing is very tricky, and I had to consult with some violinists and cellists to say, is this kosher here?
We got another question. I have a question. When you're teaching a Mozart concerto, piano concerto, do you make your students buy the orchestral score to compare it to whatever condensation, transcription is in the...
Yeah, and that brings up an excellent point. I've recently found myself in a position of basically being a walking orchestra and accompanying a lot of violinists and concertos. And usually these reductions are horrible. And I end up, that's where kind of the skill of doing your own transcriptions will come in handy because you'll know where to add things, especially if you're familiar with the orchestral score. Particularly, I think, with composers like Mozart, Beethoven, and Brahms, I think it's essential that you know the orchestral score. And even with a composer who wasn't such a wonderful orchestrator like Chopin, it's still interesting to see how he orchestrated some of these things. But and it also to know the orchestral score, other than obviously know where to come in, but you get a sense of the colors and the ranges of the instruments involved. And I think that's really valuable for a student to experience. That's a good. I always thought, I think I talked to Arthur about this, that we could probably make a killing like doing good. Because a lot of times these orchestral reductions, either they're so badly written that you can't possibly imagine this person was a pianist, because it's just awkward and just unwieldy. Or it's so plain and bare, you're just like, you're just bored to tears, and it doesn't really, it doesn't recreate the orchestral sonority that you want to help support your soloist. So, 99 times out of 100, I end up rewriting whatever, even when sometimes when the composer himself does the reduction, because I'm sure they didn't think much about it, they just knew, okay, this, and they think about what it's going to sound like in a performance. That's something that I would definitely do.
What about a realization, a continuo player? Do you make your students, are they able to take a bass line and the numbers realize it?
That's a skill, honestly, I didn't acquire until really in college when we did score reading. And that's something that's something that should be instilled a lot earlier. And that's a skill that every baroque player was, basically required to do, just as simple. And then you would show your skill by how much you could embellish upon that. And that's something that I'm particularly, I'm not particularly good at myself because I just never received the proper training at an earlier age. But, that's definitely a skill that would come in handy for something like that. Sure.
Thank you, Koji.
Sure.
I was saying